Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Bobb. I serve as director of the Hillsdale College Allan P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship. It's great to see all of you today and to welcome our online audience who's joining us coast to coast as we're webcasting this First Principles on First Friday's event. Today we're really thrilled to have with us Kirby Center Distinguished Fellow and former Member of Congress, the Honorable John Shadegg. He'll be introduced more formally in a few minutes, but I wanted to say that it's been a tremendous pleasure to come to know him and to see, having observed throughout the course of his career, what an impressive difference he made. Mr. Shadegg was elected in the freshman class of 1994, and today he's going to relate a little bit about lessons that we might learn from that 104th Congress, but even more how we can begin to make, because it certainly is a process that is going to take some time, how we can bring Congress into accountability with the Constitution of the United States. That is a task for which Mr. Shadegg is eminently suited, as it was his efforts through a number of pieces of legislation, but also day-to-day interaction with his colleagues, to stand for principled, limited government. And as we have gone around meeting with various members of especially the freshman class, it's been really most insightful to see how Mr. Shadegg can relate to these members. There's a lot of them. They're looking for guidance. They're looking for ideas. They're looking for a sense of how they can begin to resist those pressures on them that have for so long now shifted this country in a very different direction from that of the American founding. But what's great is our speaker today has a very clear sense of how that can be done, and he's going to sketch for us some thoughts on that topic. We're really pleased that he has joined us and that he has joined Hillsdale College as a distinguished fellow with the Kirby Center. As I mentioned today, and only for the second time, we are live webcasting this event. So if you're watching us from the comfort of your home or office or anywhere else around the country and wish to participate in this forum by asking a question, we'd ask that you email that question to us at First Fridays plural, at hillsdale.edu. The Kirby Center, as some of you now know, since we've been doing this lecture series since December of 2008, marks an extension of the college. Through teaching the enduring principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we seek to inspire citizens to defend those principles. You can find out more about our mission and our programs on our website at thekirbycenter.org, and we invite all of you to attend some of the other events that we're going to be holding this summer, among them an event on June the 10th, a gathering welcoming our students. Hillsdale College has for 40 years now been sending undergraduate students to Washington, D.C. We like to joke at the college that this is a study abroad program. Coming from Hillsdale, Michigan, it's a very different thing, and our purpose in sending them to Washington is not to make them cogs in the administrative state, but rather to give them a very different sense of and a continuation of their liberal education that they receive on campus. This summer, we have some 40 Hillsdale College students who are in Washington, D.C., and about 10 of those are interning with the Kirby Center. Others are interning at various think tanks, congressional offices, and media outlets around the city. One of those students is Hillsdale College junior Sophie Carr, a politics and, she's majoring in political economy and history, hails from Minnesota. She's serving an internship with the Kirby Center and will, per Hillsdale's tradition, now introduce our speaker today. Sophie.
Mr. John Shadegg was elected U.S. Representative from Arizona's 3rd Congressional District in 1994. He served 8 terms and was chairman of the conservative House Republican Study Committee. Shadegg is a veteran of the Arizona Air National Guard and served as a Special Assistant Attorney General in Arizona. A graduate of the University of Arizona, where he also received a law degree. He was the founding director of the Goldwater Institute for Public Policy. He now serves as a distinguished fellow with the Hillsdale College Kirby Center. Today he will be speaking on the timely and pressing topic, making Congress accountable to the Constitution. Please join me in welcoming Mr. John Shadegg.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for that kind introduction, Sophie. I want to thank Hillsdale College. I want to thank Dr. Larry Arnn and Dr. David Bobb, and I especially want to thank the Kirby Center for Constitutional Studies for making this opportunity available to me. It is one that's near and dear to my heart, but it is a daunting one. The issue of making Congress accountable to the Constitution is one that I think is going to require a vast amount of work, and I would suggest quite a bit of time. It cannot be done overnight. I want to begin by telling just a quick little story. Sometimes we get this notion that, well, it doesn't matter. This is a lost cause. There isn't any hope to try to bring the nation all the way back to the founding principles and get it to where we know it should be and where the founders intended it. As I listened to David make his remarks, it reminded me of a story that points out that, quite frankly, that's not true. That as a matter of fact, we have it within our power. And the story is one that I happened to just tell over at the Capitol because I was giving a brief tour to some friends who were visiting from Arizona, and I took them out on a balcony outside the Speaker's office. And I explained this story, and I think they got a kick out of it. You will see the connection because it tells the fact, or it tells makes the point of how, with concentrated effort and the right number of people committed to the cause, you can do just about anything. It turns out that when I got elected in 1994, the Republican Revolution arrived in Washington. We all got our committee assignments, and I'll talk a little bit about the corrupting process of getting committee assignments later in my remarks, but we all went about our tasks. And it was a large freshman class. You might recall, I believe there were 74 Republicans in the freshman class, maybe 73. Not quite as big as the current freshman class, but in some ways maybe more boisterous than the current freshman class, and I'd like to see the current freshman class get a little more boisterous myself. But one of the members of our class was a gentleman named Mark Neumann from Wisconsin. And Mark was a self-made millionaire. He had done well in the home building industry, and because he was a numbers guy, he had been assigned to the Appropriations Committee. And he had worked away on the Appropriations Committee, but like all freshmen, he came here filled with vim and vigor and the belief that we were going to reform Washington, and that's what we were about. We were going to change Washington. Indeed, we were not going to let Washington change us. Well, being a numbers expert, Mark was forever kind of digging into the numbers as the appropriations bills went through the process and finding where the staff was wrong or where the chairman was wrong or where we were spending much more than Mark, as a member of the freshman class of 1994, thought we ought to. And he was forever digging in the chairman's shorts and kind of saying, this isn't right, and we're spending too much, and this bill is spending too much, and this bill sets the level too high. And he was a constant frustration to the then chairman of the Appropriations Committee, a gentleman you may recall by the name of Bob Livingston. Well, on one particular occasion, Mark showed up at a committee meeting, had all his notes. They were to advance a bill that day. Mark started picking the bill apart. Now, this was a Republican-controlled Appropriations Committee. It had a Republican chairman, and Mark was, of course, a Republican. And he was picking apart the bill, and he was pointing out its flaws and how it spent too much. And finally, the time of a vote came, and Mark cast his vote, and he voted against the bill. And finally, Chairman Livingston just blew up. He'd had it. He turned to Neumann, and he said, "That's it. I can't take it anymore. You're off the committee." And so with one fell swoop, our colleague in the freshman class, Mark Neumann, had been kicked off of his main committee of assignment. Well, word of that story flashed through the freshman class like lightning. It wasn't, I'll bet you, 10 minutes before every freshman had heard the story. Even if you were sitting in a committee room somewhere halfway across the Capitol, somebody walked in, even though this was in the days before Blackberries, and said, "Hey, did you hear what happened to Mark Neumann?" Well, within less than an hour, the class met and sat down and said, "Well, what are we going to do?" And it was agreed that we simply couldn't stand by and tolerate this because we'd all kind of said to ourselves, "Oh my gosh, if Bob Livingston can kick Mark Neumann off of the Appropriations Committee, then gosh, my chairman could kick me off of my committee." So very quickly thereafter, thereafter, a call was placed to the Speaker's office, and a group of 3 of us were delegated to go sit down with the Speaker and discuss this particular issue. So we did, and the reason it comes to mind is that we did so. It was a nice day like today. It was beautiful outside, and we met with the Speaker on the balcony that looks down the mall. And it's a spectacular place. If you've ever been there, I urge you to go someday if you can. You can not only look down the mall, but you can look down Pennsylvania Avenue, and but for the trees, you could see the White House. And we sat down, 3 of us representing the freshman class, and turned to Newt and said, Mr. Speaker, this is not acceptable to our class, and if you do not resolve it, by the time the sun sets today, to Mr. Neumann's satisfaction, we, the members of the freshman class of 1994, make no guarantee that you will be Speaker of the House tomorrow. Well, Newt could count. And you discovered that in this nation, the way Founding Fathers intended it, counting matters. And it was quite true that we had created the Republican majority through our 74 freshmen. And if we had decided that night that Newt had not satisfactorily fixed this problem, then the next morning we could have sat down with the Blue Dogs or a coalition of Democrats and said, okay, let's negotiate who the next Speaker is. Well, that was not lost on us, but it was not lost on Newt. And before the sun set, the matter was resolved to Mark Neumann's satisfaction. The reason I say that to you is because I'm going to suggest 2 ways in which we can hold Congress accountable to the Constitution in my remarks. One of them is procedural, but the more important one is people. It really is you and I being engaged. It's doing what the Kirby Center and Hillsdale College are doing. The founders clearly did intend the Congress to be accountable, but they also intended it to live by the Constitution. I asked that you all be given a copy of this story, or the brief story of Davy Crockett. David Bob assured me that people who come to Kirby Center events would already be familiar with the story, and I see some nodding heads, and many of you are, but it's one we should recall, I think, over and over again. It's the famous story of a tragedy that befalls, I believe, a family out in on the far side of the city where there had been a fire in Georgetown, and the Congress is on the verge of appropriating some money to help the widow, and Davy Crockett stands up and relates the story, and the story had to do with when he had been campaigning during a previous campaign year and had been called aside by a constituent who said, you have no authority to do what you propose to do when you give away money, and you clearly don't understand the Constitution, and for that reason I won't vote for you again. And the story is worth rereading. It tells of how Davy Crockett thought through the issue and recognized that, of course, the constituent was quite right, and that there was no authority for what the Congress was proposing to do. And he rose on the floor of the House and gave a commanding speech at a point when Congress was about to do something clearly outside the Constitution, and the overwhelming vote was going to be in favor of that legislation, and Davy Crockett stopped it. But he stopped it in part because of this issue. The people had held him as a congressman accountable to the Constitution, and he had stood and led his colleagues and said to them that they needed to recognize their obligation to the Constitution. So what more can we do? How do we achieve this daunting task of holding a Congress which has drifted astray from the Constitution accountable to it? One, of course, is public awareness that we have in fact drifted away from the fundamental teachings of the Constitution. I think some of you may know the story that during the healthcare debate last year, a member of Congress, a long-term member of Congress, was confronted at an event, I believe, on the West Coast. He was a West Coast congressman from California. He was asked, well, Congressman, if you, the federal government, you, the Congress, can compel us, the citizens, to buy a health insurance policy that we don't want, either because we don't like that policy or perhaps because we don't even like allopathic medicine. We believe in naturopathic medicine. Are there any limits on what you, the Congress, can do? And it's been widely reported that this congressman thought for a moment and responded pretty quickly to say, no, there's literally nothing we can't do. That's at least one story where I think it pretty clearly illustrates very quickly how far adrift we are from the Constitution. There's one more I like to tell. It also comes from the healthcare arena where I've spent a fair amount of my time. Let me stop right here and just say I'm going to try to tell this story or make my points kind of as a pragmatic politician, because that's where my experience is. And if we want to get into kind of how we take this process back, I think it's going to involve a lot of pragmatic politics. You know, in the healthcare debate right now going on, and if you've read any of the cases that are being argued, the justification being given by the government for compelling us, for being able to compel us all to buy a health insurance policy, compel us to spend our money to buy a private sector product, is that, and the government argues this in their briefs, that uninsured individuals sitting in their homes doing nothing affect interstate commerce. Well, how do they affect interstate commerce? Well, the government argues that they affect interstate commerce because the mere decision not to buy health insurance shifts costs from that individual to the rest of society. Well, now think about that for a moment. You're sitting in your home, you're doing absolutely nothing but, say, reading the Federalist Papers, as you should be, and you've chosen not to buy any health insurance, and some lawyer for the federal government says you are shifting costs in the healthcare system, and since you're shifting costs, that affects or that impacts interstate commerce. It substantially impacts interstate commerce, and therefore, in the exercise of the Commerce Clause, the federal government can reach out to you, sitting on your couch in your living room reading the Federalist Papers, and say, get up and go buy a health insurance policy that we have dictated the contents of, and when you've done that, we promise we won't fine you. Well, in its brief, making this argument that you have shifted costs, it caused me to think for at least a moment and say, now, wait a minute, how did you shift costs? Well, let's think it through just one more step. Let's say you got up out of the couch, you walked to the nearest hospital, you presented yourself at the front door, you held out your arm and said, look, it's broken, set it, and give the bill to David Bob. He's a nice, successful young businessman. He clearly can pay this bill. You think the hospital would do that? I suspect they wouldn't do that. Not hardly. But nonetheless, that's what the government argues. The government might say, well, we're not going to quite do it that way. We're going to say that when you got up out of your couch and went to the hospital and held out your arm and said it's broken and said, please fix it, and, oh, by the way, send the bill to David Bob, what you really did is send the bill to David Bob's insurance company. But the reality is you don't shift any costs. So, and fortunately, in his decision, in the Florida case, Judge Vinson says, absolutely not. Your decision to sit in your home, on your couch, and read the Federalist Papers or do whatever else you choose to do doesn't shift any costs at all. But why did the government have to go there? Because the government wanted to impose a penalty on you. It wanted to be able to force you to buy a health insurance policy that you didn't, in fact, want, because it claimed that you were shifting this cost. But let's dig a little bit deeper, because Judge Vinson, in his opinion, didn't dig any deeper into the why are costs being shifted. This is a hot debate in the briefs if you read them going back and forth. And the answer is costs are in fact being shifted. But why are they being shifted? Because I think if you ask the question of why they're being shifted, you discover why the government, in fact, is the last entity in the world that ought to be able to impose the penalty it's chosen, which is to force us to buy a health insurance policy. And let me explain the why. As a society, we've decided long ago that nobody should go without health care. We also decided that in this society, nobody should go without at least basic health care, but also without basic food or without basic shelter. And so years ago, when I was a kid growing up, if someone who became ill in Phoenix, Arizona, did not have the money to be able to go to a hospital and get an arm set if it was broken, we said not to worry about that. We as a society have made a societal decision that you shouldn't leave your arm unset. And so the thing that you did if you couldn't pay the bill is you went to a public hospital. In Phoenix, Arizona, you went to Maricopa County Hospital, and a doctor there set your arm. And that doctor was compensated by public money. Now, how do we get, if that was true, then how did you get to where we are now? And the answer is that in the late 1980s, the United States Congress, by the way, at the behest of the same congressman who said there are no limits on the power of the federal Congress anymore, passed a law called EMTALA. Now, EMTALA is the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. And EMTALA says that if you're a hospital in America, or you're a doctor working at a hospital in America, and somebody presents at that hospital and has a broken arm, you must set their arm for free. Okay, I'm fine with that. Because that's society's decision that those amongst us shouldn't have to do without basic health care. But guess what the government then did? The government said, and oh, by the way, you're going to be compelled to do that if you're a hospital that has an emergency room and accepts Medicare. And oh, by the way, we're not going to pay you. Everyone in this room, I think, knows that in America today, you can walk into any hospital you choose, and if you don't have the resources, you get free medical care. But not many people realize that nobody pays for, the federal government doesn't pay for that health care anymore. The federal government doesn't write a check, the local county government doesn't write a check, the local state government writes a check. The government just orders doctors and hospitals to do that. Now imagine for just a moment if we ordered grocery stores. We said, you know what, there are some people in this country who don't have food, so we're just going to issue an order that says if you own a grocery store, or if you own a ranch, or if you own a farm and you raise corn, and a certain number of people present themselves for food, you must give it to them. Funny thing, we don't do that. Instead, we created a program called food stamps, and that program provides food to those in need. In housing, the same is true, but in health care, we chose to cut the corner. How did we get into such a deep problem as led us to the passage of Obamacare? The answer is we ignored the Constitution. And I think everybody in the room knows it. Here's how we ignored the Constitution. This little document has an amendment, Fifth Amendment. Many of us know it. We talk about it a lot in the criminal area because it says you cannot be compelled to be a witness against yourself. But the last clause of the Fifth Amendment says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Guess what? Where in the world are America's hospitals and doctors? I got a clue none of them has ever read the dang Fifth Amendment. Because the Fifth Amendment says, no property shall be taken for public use without just compensation. And yet, under EMTALA, we are saying to every hospital in America, you must deliver care to anyone who presents themselves, even if they don't have an insurance policy. That's property. You must give it to people, public in the society, so it's the taking of property for public use. And guess what? When Congress passed this bill, it said, by the way, we're not going to compensate you. It's not, we're not going to give you just compensation, which is one of the debates under the law. It's not whether or not this was a good public purpose. We're not going to give you a dime. We're going to force you under EMTALA to provide free health care. I would suggest that the reason that we got into the debate over Obamacare, and the reason that the government wants to go to that kind of a system. But the reason it says that, the justification for the Commerce Clause saying that we can force you to buy a health insurance policy you don't want, is cost shifting caused by the very federal government that now says to you it's going to take your freedom to make your own personal decision on whether to buy that insurance policy, a different insurance policy, or no policy at all. Because if EMTALA either didn't exist, and hospitals could turn you away and send you to a public hospital, there would be no cost shifting. If alternatively, the federal government hadn't ignored the last clause of the Fifth Amendment and recognized that when it orders hospitals to give away free health care, it must also provide just compensation, then there would be no cost shifting. If there were no cost shifting, then there would be no impact on commerce, and in point of fact, there would be no justification for the government to order you to buy a health insurance policy you don't want. All of that is to say what? I think all of it is to make the point that when we ignore things like this Constitution and the Fifth Amendment, or when we let the Congress ignore them in passing a law like EMTALA, which clearly is an unconstitutional taking under the Fifth Amendment, then we're in pretty deep trouble as a society. Indeed, I would argue that the Congress in this nation today is pretty well unhinged from the Constitution. So the topic is, how do we do something about it? And I have, as I mentioned earlier, two suggestions. The first of them is a procedural suggestion, and that is there are procedural reforms that we can enact and some that we already have. We have, since the founding, said to members of Congress that you must take an oath of office, and that oath of office compels you to swear allegiance to the Constitution. Unfortunately, between the United States Supreme Court and the greed or avarice of the federal government government and seeking more and more power. That oath hasn't been enough. This year, I am very encouraged that Speaker John Boehner took one step further and required the United States Congress on the day it was sworn in to read the Constitution. That's at least a beginning. But there's one more point that they did this year that was something I campaigned on in 1994. In 1994, I told my constituents that I intended to introduce when I got here a law that would say that every member of the Congress, House or Senate, who introduces a piece of legislation must cite in the first section of that piece of legislation the specific enumerated power set forth in the U.S. Constitution that grants the federal government the authority to do whatever it is that is proposed to be done in that particular bill. If you go back and look at each piece of legislation that I introduced in my 16 years in Congress, I'm pleased to say that we in fact did insert a constitutional justification in every single one of them. But this is one of those reforms that required me to leave Congress before it got accomplished. Because what happened this year is, when I retired from Congress, John Boehner and others in the United States House, including Scott Garrett from New Jersey and Congressman Bishop from Utah, insisted that the bill I had introduced as the Enumerated Powers Act become a part of the rules of the U.S. House. And so it is true today that if you as a member of the U.S. House, sadly not the Senate yet, introduce or seek to introduce a bill in the U.S. House and you take it up to the clerk and you offer it to the clerk, and you do not proffer at the same time a separate piece of paper that sets forth the constitutional justification for that bill, the clerk will simply hand it back to you. Or if you drop it in the box and leave, the clerk will send it back to you, which I think is a tremendous first step. The law of the House today is, or the rules of the House today say, you must file a constitutional justification, an identification of which enumerated power authorizes the federal government and the U.S. Congress to enact legislation in that area. A funny story about that, when I first went to introduce that bill, it was during the Gingrich Revolution. I believe the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time was Henry Hyde. I know the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee at the time was Charles Kennedy, who I believe is now, if not the Chief Justice, at least a justice of the Florida Supreme Court. And yet when I brought the bill in and went to take it to them to say, look, will you please hold a hearing on this bill? I met with a young staffer who looked at me and said, Congressman, do you have any idea what this would do? And I said, well, I think I do. And this young lady was quite perplexed. She said, well, gosh, if I think back about it, we reauthorize lots of existing programs, and I'm not sure I could think up a constitutional justification for many of those programs. And I said, well, I'm really sorry to hear that, but I think that makes the point for why it ought to be enacted into law. Long story short, she killed it. It remained, I introduced it every session of Congress that I was in. When my good friends Tom Coburn and Jim DeMint left the House and had the good sense to go to the United States Senate, each of them took it over there and they introduced it on the Senate side. And it continues to move forward, but it is at least a part of the procedures of the House, and I hope someday becomes a part of the procedures as well. So one of the things we can do are procedural reforms, or strict reforms of that type. I would suggest to you that more importantly, however, are human reforms. It is having an engaged and, importantly, an educated electorate that remains deeply involved in the process. And I want to conclude my remarks fairly quickly here, but let me just talk about that point. And let me try to illustrate it with some quick stories. There simply is no substitute for what is happening here at the Kirby Center. There simply is no substitute for what is happening at the campus of Hillsdale College. And there simply is no substitute for what is happening at Tea Party meetings across the country. The bottom line answer is, if we are to hold the United States Congress accountable to the Constitution, we must A, recognize the teachings of the Constitution ourselves, and B, we must be prepared to be very engaged. Let me illustrate that with a couple of quick stories. When I got elected in 1994, I came to Washington and I was a part of the revolution, and I genuinely believed that everybody here had the same idea of reform as I did. After all, we had the contract with America, we knew where we wanted to go, we knew we were going to restrain the growth of government, we were going to have it tax less, spend less, and interfere in people's lives less, and by gosh, we were going to change Washington. Guess what? Every freshman class, certainly every large freshman class, maybe every small freshman class, maybe every freshman who at least came here out of a drive of principle believes exactly that the day they first arrive in Washington. But I want to tell you a story. It's a pretty hard place to do that job. When I first ran for Congress, I put together a list of my dad's friends. My father had run, as some of you may know, Barry Goldwater's first campaign for the United States Senate. He had run Senator Goldwater's subsequent Senate campaigns. The first time I had come to Washington was to visit my dad living in the Jefferson Hotel running a part of the Goldwater for President campaign. First time I ever went to San Francisco was to go to the Cow Palace and see the '64 convention. But what I discovered when I got here, well, I put together this list of my dad's friends. One of them was an Undersecretary of Agriculture under President Reagan named John Norton. And I went to John Norton and said, I'm going to run for John Kyle's seat if John Kyle runs for the U.S. Senate. And he said, that's fantastic. He came across the table and shook my hand and said, I'll help you. But then he sat down, and over the course of the lunch hour where we chatted, he said, John, you need to understand, there is no place on the face of the earth where the pressure to go along, to get along, is greater than in Washington, D.C. And if we are to hold members of Congress accountable to the Constitution, each of us not only needs to understand the Constitution and what we're seeking to hold them accountable to, we need to understand the pressures that come to bear on the people that come to this town with good intentions. We came back here as a class in 1994 with the idea of changing everything. We were going to end smoke-filled rooms. We were going to end backroom deals. We were going to end the process whereby powerful members of Congress can direct spending to benefit themselves personally or in some other way inconsistent with the intent of the founders. And oh wow, did we have an education. As many of you know, and I think as history has pretty well written, rather than changing Washington, the class of 1994 over a period of time got to where it allowed Washington to change it. We made a lot of good progress, and I'm proud of a lot of what we did, but by some of the things I think they're worth noting, and I tell lots of audiences this, we said in the Contract with America that we were going to restore the bonds of trust between the American people and the United States Congress. And that produced Bob Ney, it produced Duke Cunningham, and it produced Jack Abramoff. It seems to me that was not the establishment of the bonds of trust. But what I want to say to you is, rather than being angry at those freshman class, when they come and meet that kind of pressure, you need to understand the pressure. We, as a society, need to understand that pressure, and we need to make them understand we know the pressure new members of Congress come under to get along when they get here. You see, when they get here, they discover, oh, those people back home, they elected me. But if I want to advance my career here, well, then I've got to become a reliable vote. I've got to make my subcommittee chairman happy, or I don't get my bill heard, or my full committee chairman happy, or I don't get my bill heard. I've got to make the leadership happy, or I don't get the committee assignment I desperately want. And for us to be naive about some of those procedural things, I think means we can't hope to achieve the goal we want. And the answer, again, I would suggest to you is that as each freshman class comes, they come with high ideals and strong beliefs, but they come into a system that begins to say to them, go along to get along. Do what you're told. Comport to the norm in Washington, because that's how you advance your career. One of the things I like to do is I like to get the freshmen together and say, hey, stop. It may look to you when you arrive in this town that your future or your career is controlled by those people above you, whether it's the speaker, the majority leader, the whip, your committee chair, and others, and they have some control. The reality is you better remember your bosses are the 600,000 people that sent you here. And that's where you're supposed to be accountable. And if you remain accountable to and think about the people who elected you, you'll do just fine here. I'm going to tell one more funny story and then conclude and hopefully take questions. When we got here, we had written the Contract with America. In that day, they brought all the freshmen in. We all signed it. It was a big deal. Shortly into our term, the leadership decided to put on the floor of the House, and trust me, we did a lot of great things. We passed the Shays Act. We did some great things. But leadership decided to put on the floor a version of the Balanced Budget Amendment that was different than the one in the Contract with America. Well, not unlike the story I told you about Mark Neumann, our class, the freshman class, the true reformers said, wait, you can't do that. And I was always want to get these kinds of jobs. They said, John, you need to go tell Dick Armey that the freshman class won't support that version of the balanced budget amendment. After all, we'd made the promise. I don't know if you've ever seen the Life commercial that had to do with Mikey Likes It. I was Mikey of the freshman class. I got to do those things. So I went off. I made an appointment with Dick Armey. I went off to see him in his office. He was newly ensconced in that office. And I went in and we sat down, and it started with a pleasant little chat back and forth. What's it like being a freshman? Are you enjoying things? You know, we're going back and forth. How do you think things are going? It's very pleasant. After a few minutes, Mrs. Armey came into the room and said, oh, boys, don't let me bother you. I'm just going to be putting some things up. She was decorating the majority leader's office. And I thought, well, that's very nice. And ultimately I said, you know, Mr. Majority Leader, I came here for a reason. I came here to explain to you that we have a problem. Oh, really? What's that? Well, the conversation starts to go like this. I say, the freshman class simply will not tolerate and doesn't agree with leadership's decision to put on the floor a version of the balanced budget amendment different than that which was in the contract with America. We've given our word. It's important to us to keep our word. We're connected closely to the people back home. They just sent us here. They expect us to live up to our word. We got to do that. And Dick, bright scholar himself, solid conservative, said, well, John, you know, that's all well and good, but, and he began to explain to me why it was impossible and we just simply could not put the version of the balanced budget amendment on the floor that had been in the contract with America. Well, I said, you better. He said, we can't. I said, you better. He said, we can't. The argument got more and more intense, and finally, Dick and I are just short of yelling at each other at full throttle. And Mrs. Armey comes over and taps Dick on the shoulder and says, I think I'll step outside. Because it had become a little too intense. I would suggest to you that if, in fact, we as a nation are going to return to the founding principles, if indeed we are going to make Congress accountable to this, it's going to get a little bit like the conversation Dick Armey and I had. And that is to say, it's going to get a little hot, but I think it's worth doing. And I so very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you today, and would be happy to answer any of your questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Sir, thank you for your service. My question is, you've talked eloquently about the gridlock here and that structure that freshmen have to deal with. But my question is, how do I as a citizen, I understand I need to work in a precinct locally, I need to call and write when I have a specific concern, but are there things that we can do as Tea Party groups, are there things we can do as individuals to overcome the lobbyists' influence, to overcome the party influence, and help our congresspeople and our senators to remember that we're standing there ready to pull a lever the next time they go to the polls?
There is absolutely, not only is there something you can do or things you can do, there are things that you absolutely must do. Indeed, we absolutely must do if we are to have any hope of returning this nation to what I think the founders intended. It really spans the panoply. One of the things that I used to tell people in my early term in Congress is that news travels to Arizona by covered wagon. And what I meant by that is that in those days, kind of heady days of a freshman class determined to change this city and everything about it, doing battle day to day, quite frankly, with our own leadership, telling them again and again and again they weren't going far enough, I would be engaged in those battles, and I would go home and I'd get off the plane and I'd meet my wife, and she was, you know, a loving spouse and had been engaged in my campaign to get involved and was an informed person. And out across America, those fights were sub rosa. Nobody knew a thing. She didn't have a clue. And not only did she not have a clue, she had a little bit of a clue compared to the people in the society, but quite frankly, almost nobody knew. And it goes on. And the answer is you really, you have to stay very informed. And that's becoming phenomenally easier than it was. When I was a kid growing up and Barry Goldwater ran for the Senate the first time, in those days, senators and House members, I think pretty much, would fly to Washington in January and fly back home in June. And they'd be gone from here in the summertime, so you wouldn't see them for months at a time. Today, we have members go home every single weekend. We have the internet, we have blogs, we have that vast amount of information, and yet the very same thing goes on. And I'm going to relate a story that'll probably get me in a little bit of trouble, but it's a true story, and the truth, they say in the law, is a perfect defense. You may recall that during the CR debate this year, the initial demand by Republicans was that we wanted $100 billion in cuts. By gosh, we want $100 billion in cuts. Well, some discussion went back and forth and said, well, no, that number, 100 billion, came out of the Pledge to America. And that Pledge to America was for a full year's spending, and we're only talking about the continuing resolution, which was just the finish of this year's spending, because the Democrats, oh, by the way, hadn't passed a budget or any spending bills. So we scaled it back and we said, let's go with a number and let's make it 67 billion or 61 billion, somewhere in that vicinity. As we all know, the negotiations began, and at the end of the day, we got 38 billion. Now, I don't know, it used to be that you'd say, well, do you remember where you were when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? And everybody could say, I don't know if you remember where you were when the Speaker came forward, Speaker Boehner, and announced the $38 billion number, but I know where I was. I was at a Right to Life dinner in Phoenix, Arizona. I looked at my BlackBerry and I thought, wow, 38 billion. Not quite what I'd hoped for, but maybe that's the best we could do. Maybe that's genuine. I got up the next morning, I read the paper, it looked like it was a pretty good number. I followed the number Sunday morning and Monday morning and Tuesday morning, and then what happened? The truth came out. The 38 billion is made up of a huge bunch of money out of the census that was over. So we saved a bunch of money by not spending money on a census that we'd already finished? Another huge block of that money came out of a crime victims fund, where the money in the fund was never tax money to begin with. They were bonds posted by criminals who skipped the bond, or they were fines paid by criminals. And we called that a savings in federal spending. By the way, we gypped the victims of the money that was supposed to go to. I think you all know that the number really, at least AP came out with a number saying that $38 billion figure, the real savings was less than 1% of that figure. Now, how does that relate to your question? What I watched very closely was, okay, will America erupt? Will we, bring, the sunshine on the U.S. Congress? They hadn't by Wednesday, when these stories came out, voted. They didn't vote until, I think, Thursday or Friday. The stories had been out for at least 2 days, and nothing happened. I will tell you, and this will get me in a little trouble myself, I have a friend deeply involved in the National Tea Party movement. I called her and said, Jenny, are you guys going to expose this? And the reality is, it didn't happen. But the answer is, you have to get involved and you have to expose it. The Congress voted on that and then went home for a week recess. I know the Tea Party did some attempt to hold them accountable. I would say to you, don't be shy. Let me tell you another story. I got deeply involved in the healthcare reform issue, not because when I was a kid growing up, I cared about healthcare or healthcare reform. As a matter of fact, I hate hospitals. And I grew up saying I hate hospitals. But I was in a Boy Scout troop with 2 guys who happened to become doctors. One of them was the son of a doctor and 1 year older than me. The other one became a doctor, and he was 1 year behind me. The guy older than me taught me how to tie a square knot, and I taught the guy below me how to tie a square knot. And when I got elected to Congress, they were not shy. They came to me and said, John, here's what's happening in healthcare. And they taught me. What I would suggest to you, to try to give you a practical suggestion, is do a little bit of thinking. I have a friend back in Phoenix who uses what he calls the string theory. He says, John, when you see a problem, you lower your head and go straight into the wall. And you get wherever you get. And he said, it's kind of a painful way to do it, but that's your approach. He says to me, that's not the way I go at things. I use the string theory. And the string theory is to think about the person you want to affect. And then think about somebody who knows them, and somebody who knows that guy, and somebody who knows that woman, and somebody who knows that woman, and someone who knows the next guy, all the way back until you get to somebody you know. And you you try to affect them by the string theory. What I would suggest to you is that everybody in this room, if you spend a little time thinking about it, knows someone who knows someone who knows someone who was in a Boy Scout troop or a Girl Scout troop or a Kiwanis club with your current congressman. And you need to figure that out, and you need to get in front of them. And when they vote for $38 billion in cuts, which turn out to be less than 1% of that, they need to hear about it. And you have to just go get in their face. And most of them, I think today, will take a phone call and agree to a meeting with any legitimate Tea Party group or group of citizens in their community. And it's just that simple. You just got to go do it. You got to be informed, and you got to have the courage to go confront them. Yes, ma'am.
Would you say it's fair to assume that if this were not a career, in other words, if there were term limits, that there would be no need for vote buying or for going along to get along?
The fact that it is a career is indeed a serious issue. Having said that, I must confess to you I have mixed emotions about whether term limits are the right correction. It is true, and it's the point I tried to make in my remarks earlier. When you get elected as a freshman, your goal, hopefully, is advance the Constitution or advance, the nation, do good for the nation. You discover that, well, if I want to advance my career, then maybe that conflicts with what's good for the nation. Or maybe it conflicts with what I told the people back home. And that's the conflict I see in the freshman class. It's the conflict my class encountered with the old bulls of 1995. And I think we need to institute things to hold career politicians in check. But you also will remember that my enumerated powers bill was killed not by Henry Hyde and not by Charles Kennedy. It was killed by a staffer. One of the things you have to ask yourself about term limits, and some of my bright friends back in Arizona say they could go along with term limits if you term limited staff as well, which might indeed be what we need to do. I certainly think that one of the most corrupting influences is the desire to advance your own career. And careerism, people who stay forever. My friend Tom Coburn rails against careerism, and I think he's right about it. I just don't know that term limits are the best answer. I think a great answer is what happened when we had the summer debates on Obamacare, and members got confronted by an engaged and educated electorate that said, don't do this. Unfortunately, Mrs. Pelosi overbore their will, and as a result of that, she lost the majority and a huge number of seats. My own personal view is that holding members accountable is a better device. If we do term limits, I would like to see us do them with a fairly long period, like 12 years was talked about at one point in time. In Arizona, we've enacted term limits for our state legislature, and I do not believe it has proven to be a good reform. But I certainly think if we do term limits, I'm not willing to reject term limits outright, but I think if we proceed down a course of heading toward term limits, we need to be very thoughtful about it. In the Arizona legislature, we have very short term limits, and people just bounce back and forth from one house to the other, but they also have no institutional memory. So I would watch the power of staff. Staff already is extremely powerful. Indeed, one of the things you can ask is, if we have to hold the Congress accountable, is the Congress accepting responsibility for its own conduct even now, or do they delegate it all to staff members? One of the issues, TARP. TARP is one of the most controversial votes that occurred in my tenure in Congress, and it was a stunning delegation of power to other people. That is a lack of responsibility even by the current members. I've watched some good people leave as a result of term limits. Tom Coburn left as a result of a 6-year term limit imposed on him, 3-term term limit, 6-year term limit imposed on himself. My friend Matt Salmon left. Interestingly, Tom Coburn came back and became, one of the best United States senators going in my book. Interestingly, Matt Salmon, who also self-term limited himself, left after 3 terms, is running again for the House this year. So certainly if we enact term limits with the goal in mind of getting rid of career politicians, we need to think about how we do it, and we need to think about it, and it must apply to everyone, and we'd have to think about applying it to staff as well.
Our next question comes from online, and Mike from Seattle, Washington asks, no one likes making hard decisions, This seems especially true for Congress. When an issue seems too difficult, they often just punt their duty to the Supreme Court. The Constitution has suffered as a result. Institutionally, how can we make Congress want to reclaim its authority from a majority of 5 justices?
Wow. Well, both the Congress and the court have participated in this erosion of limits of the Constitution. Certainly the court has gone a long way. I would say right now there's reason to be encouraged about the court. But the question was, how can we do that institutionally? I'm not certain I have a good answer for that. I think obviously electing the right president and electing a Senate that will use its responsibilities appropriately. And if necessary, not being afraid to amend the Constitution where we need to amend the Constitution. All of those are procedural devices that we could use. One of the things that I worry about every bit as much as the threat imposed by Congress ignoring its responsibilities and delegating power either to the administration, as it did in TARP, or passing vague legislation and giving that authority to the courts and letting the courts decide what the meaning of words is the willingness of Congress to allow the, not the willingness of Congress, the willingness of us as a people and the willingness of the states to allow the amassing of such immense power here in Washington. I would suggest kind of the challenge of today is not just to be aware that the court has excessive power, but that we've moved too much power out of the states and to the federal government. I would suggest, and it's a radical notion, but it ought to at least be on the table, perhaps the Founding Fathers had it right when they called for the election of the United States senators by the state legislatures and not directly by the people. That's a constitutional amendment, so it's consistent with the Constitution because it was amended. But if you ask yourself for just a moment, would a United States senator who had owed his job to the state legislature be willing to participate in a process which stole so much authority from the state legislature and gave it all to this massive central government, which kind of seems not to care too much about the states or their role in this process. So I think it's good that we're debating those issues. I wish I had a more specific one. Of course, there are issues debating whether or not we ought to hold a constitutional convention, and we could get the room quite excited about that. But other questions?
I'm intrigued by your vision of asking for defining why it's part of the Constitution when they put forth a bill. And I'm curious what your vision would be regarding the authorization of some of these bills that the staffer was referring to. In particular, I'll throw one out if you want.
Sure.
The Endangered Species Act, which I think involves taking.
My view, first of all, I think we need this discussion. David, Bob, and I have talked about the fact, it's easy to stand here and say the Founding Fathers had a better vision, and oh my gosh, look how far we've drifted from that, how much power we've moved out of the states and to the federal government, and how much power we've granted to the federal government to do things that it has literally no authority whatsoever to do. In my class, we talked about, for example, repealing the Federal Department of Education, and of course we never got there. When I introduced the Enumerated Powers Act, there were various thoughts out there. One was that you could not just require them to cite the provision of the Constitution, the enumerated power that gave Congress the authority to do it. If they didn't do that, you could not allow the bill to be introduced, or you could have a procedure whereby it could be stricken for that purpose. What I wanted to do was simply begin the discussion. But as many of you know, particularly here at the Kirby Center, this has now begun a genuine debate where members of Congress today, living under the new House rule, are looking at an idea that a constituent brought them and saying, well, I want to introduce it as a law. My constituents like this idea. I think it's a good idea. I want you to introduce it. Their staff goes about the task of drafting the bill and then says to the congressman, hey, what are we going to put down as the constitutional justification? And as David will tell you, the students here at the Kirby Center are being asked to draft justifications, and they're not taking it lightly. They're not just citing the general welfare clause and saying, well, that justifies everything. They are instead engaged in a genuine debate. Is this legitimate? What I'd like to see happen is perhaps somebody at the end of that debate saying, look, we can't find a legitimate justification. And then I'm looking for the member of Congress who picks up the phone and says to the constituent, you know, we have this new rule in Congress. It would be better if it were a statute like I wanted it to be, but we have this new rule in Congress that says I have to cite a provision of the Constitution that justifies the bill you wanted me to drop. I think you have a great idea in this bill, but we can't find it anywhere, like Davy Crockett. We cannot find it anywhere in the Constitution as something that the federal government is authorized to do. And therefore, I've called State Legislator Smith and said that, asked him if he'd be willing to drop this as a state statute, and I think you ought to go talk to him. And that would at least begin the process. Certainly there are many aspects of the Endangered Species Act which have clearly resulted in a taking, and I think a more activist, property rights-oriented Supreme Court hopefully will someday rule that much more often than it has so far. But I'd like to see that debate begin even earlier up. My friend Scott Garrett from New Jersey wants a much more vigorous version of the Enumerated Powers Act, where if you can't prove to the Congress in debate that, in point of fact, there is a legitimate basis in the Constitution for the introduction of the bill or the passage of the bill or the assumption of that power by the federal government, it simply can't go forward. And there's a procedural rule that would stop it. I'm all for it. I just hope we can get there in my lifetime. But I think your point is well taken. I think the debate is a part of the process, but we would all acknowledge that that the staffer who said to me, oh my gosh, Congressman, there are lots of things we're doing now that for which there is no constitutional justification, we all would acknowledge that that staffer is right. That's why I said at the beginning of our remarks, the job of holding Congress accountable to the Constitution is going to be a long trail. It took us 200 plus years to get where we are. I hope it won't take us that long to get back, but at least we're having the discussion. And at least organizations like the Kirby Center and across the street at the Heritage Foundation, they're looking at these kinds of issues.
This will be our final question.
Okay.
Since Impala was clearly unconstitutional taking, was there any challenge at the time, and could it be challenged now by a hospital which is forced to pay money? Would they have standing?
It's a great question, and I'm actually very glad you asked it. Here is the basis on which the Congress acted. The Congress said, we're going to compel you to give free health care at any hospital to anyone who presents, even without proof that they can pay the bill and if they never pay the bill. And without citizenship. That's right. In Arizona and the southwestern United States, we treat lots of people who, of course, are not citizens. But what the Congress said was, you only have to meet that requirement if two things are true. One, you have an emergency room. Interestingly, some hospitals across America are actually contemplating, specialty hospitals at least, simply doing away with their emergency room. Because if you don't have an emergency room, you don't come within the ambit of EMTALA. But the real hook on which the lower courts have held it to not a taking are that it is a condition of Medicare. So if your hospital accepts Medicare, then you must give free EMTALA care. Now, the argument under that goes, well, you're not compelling them to give something away for free because you're letting them participate in the Medicare program and they get profit out of the Medicare program, and therefore it is a justifiable trade-off. The specific answer to your question is that the lower federal courts, I believe the Fourth Circuit, and maybe one or two other circuits have heard this issue and have sustained it on that basis. They have said, yes, you can condition the participation in the Medicare program on treating patients under EMTALA for free. The problem with that is it's a little bit like, what's the takings case that was debated very vigorously lately or recently? Kelo, right. It's a little bit like the Kelo case in that there's, I think, an issue of equities. If you talk to a hospital in America today, most hospitals will tell you, if we did not participate in Medicare, which would get us out from EMTALA, then we could not survive as a hospital because Medicare insures everyone in America, all the elderly in America, and without that patient base, it's the elderly patients that use hospitals, we simply couldn't exist. I think a careful examination would raise the question of, well, is it appropriate for the government to say, you can condition Medicare participation in Medicare on accepting free patient or giving free care under EMTALA if there's no practical way in which the hospitals could say no, and if alternatively you look at how much money it's costing them. If they, quite frankly, they aren't making much profit on Medicare, indeed, because the politicians promise all these benefits under Medicare and then only pay for a fraction of them, these hospitals are arguably losing money on Medicare. If you then turn around and say, but they're making a little money, they may be losing it on the margin, and they may be cost shifting from Medicare to their privately insured patients, then how do they pay for the free care, so-called free care they give under EMTALA? And the answer is, I think that's where the taking occurs. Also, the second answer to your question is, since the issue has not been taken to the United States Supreme Court, it could be taken to the Supreme Court, and I would hope that some hospital or doctors group in America will take it to the United States Supreme Court. Interestingly, if you talk to people in the medical practice, you'll discover all kinds of practical things have happened when you ignore the Constitution. One, doctors feel like if they see a patient in a hospital emergency room and they provide care to that patient for free because it's an EMTALA patient, that patient then, if that patient then needs follow-up care, doctors are fearful not to give that follow-up care in their offices for free. And that has caused a great deal of concern. Why they have not sued over that, I don't know, except that the interesting consequence is that there are a couple of other consequences. One, doctors used to give away, I would suggest, by today's terms, billions, if not trillions of dollars in free care. But you can imagine what doctor says to himself today, well, why should I be giving away free care? Or what hospital says to itself today, why should I be giving away free care when the government has a gun at my head saying I have to give away free care, and oh, by the way, it's breaking me. And that's what I find so fascinating about the concession by the lawyers in the federal case in front of Judge Vinson in Florida, at least, where it's been argued very clearly, and you can see the arguments, where the federal lawyers are saying, look, the decision by all of these people not to buy health insurance is causing massive health care cost shifting to the insured people. Therefore, that impacts interstate commerce, and we can order some innocent person to go buy an insurance policy. But it was you, the very government, that caused the cost shifting in the first place by refusing to abide by the Fifth Amendment. The short answer to your question is the Constitution of EMTALA, I don't know if the specific issue of the Fifth Amendment has been raised. I know that the justification has been discussed in cases. The justification is, since you if you want to take Medicare patients and receive Medicare payments, you must provide free care under EMTALA. What's important, I think, for us to remember as a society is we kind of think, well, that's the way it always was. But it isn't the way it always was. When many of us in this room were kids, there was no EMTALA. People without money didn't go to private hospitals. People without money went to the public hospital. They got care, as we as a society have decided they should, but we paid for it. And I think we're willing to pay for it. I don't think anybody in this debate is saying we want people in this society to go without care. What we're saying is we don't want the government taking our freedom to pick an insurance policy of our own choice. I hope somebody will sue EMTALA, challenge it constitutionally, a doctor or a hospital, and say it is in fact, and the courts will ultimately conclude it is in fact a taking under the Fifth Amendment. Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this. Thank you.